Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Why Politics Matters here on Salam Radio 106.2 FM. Very, very happy to be back. Glad to be back after a week's break. I've been away to Pakistan, but I'm back now and we've got a very pertinent show, a very timely show, and we've got a very special guest who I will introduce in a moment. But before I do, hello Alex.
Good evening. Welcome back. How was your trip?
It was really good. Really, really good. Good to see you again.
You look very well and rested, I have to say.
Yeah, I know you missed me. I know you missed me. Yeah, good. Well, I missed you too. And I missed the listeners, and I hope the listeners missed us. Our special guest today is Councillor Nicola Day, leader of the Green Group on the Peterborough City Council, long-term involved in politics, but more recently, obviously involved a little bit more in green politics. Nicola, welcome.
Good evening.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for talking about climate change and the environment.
Yeah, this is, I mean, sometimes I just think, like, why is everyone not talking about it all the time? But it's one of those things that you get tired, don't you? You get depressed. It's a really tiring subject to talk about sometimes, and then the more you hear, the more upset you get, and you almost feel like it's futile, but absolutely it should be on the forefront of people's minds. Just a little bit about yourself, and which you've been on the show, not this show, but you've been on Salam Radio before. I believe you're on the Ansar Ali show, talking about similar things.
Yeah, I came on Ansar's show to talk about the floods in Pakistan, which obviously due to the glaciers melting and unseasonably hot summer and a heavy monsoon season caused huge flooding in Pakistan. 33 million people affected.
So that was like August, September last year, wasn't it? Yeah.
So I came on to talk about that and to talk about what we need to see in terms of climate justice for countries like Pakistan, which don't have the infrastructure in place to deal with such tragedies. So that's what I was talking about.
Yeah, I mean, from the Pakistani community myself, that was a massive issue in the Pakistani community, and you know, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds was raised and sent over to help relief efforts, and along with that continue. But I mean, you might be surprised to learn that actually, you know, people residents, Pakistani people residents, say they're genuinely interested in green, green content, green subjects, and just like what is going on and how we can do things. Alex, Why Politics Matters, we've done a number of shows on a number of different topics. This one's a little bit off our regular beaten path. Why is this important, and why does this come under the political sphere, do you think?
I suppose really climate change is the biggest crisis, I was going to say of our lifetime, but really of our existence. It is the one that will dictate our future. And I'm going to be honest, it's probably the one which really pulled me into politics and re-enfranchised me and woke me up to the world the most. Because at the end of the day, it is so linked to the systems that we operate in, and in particularly capitalism itself. And the solutions for it, I have to say, I feel have to lie outside these systems. Yeah.
So just before we start with the conversation, because there's a number of things I want to cover today, I want to obviously not educate, it's not patronize, I don't want to be patronizing, but maybe just inform our listeners exactly what we're talking about, what the causes are, what the effects are, what our current trajectory is, what the possible solutions might be, and I guess most importantly, certainly for me, is what can we do to to change policy and actually move the dial on what looks like almost, you know, certain calamity. So those are the kind of things. But Nicola, do you want to just start us off with you know, how would you describe or define climate change?
Okay, so a definition of climate change is a change in global or regional climate patterns from mid to late 20th century attributed largely to increased levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide produced by the use of fossil fuels. This is coupled with ecosystem collapse, that's the degradation of nature and habitats, which is caused by human destruction. So that's what I understand as climate change. It's both climate and ecological at the same time.
So let's break that down then. So it's you said something about carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We've all heard about the greenhouse effect. What is the greenhouse effect, and how does carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increase the greenhouse effect?
Okay.
Is that a bit basic? Do you reckon that's a bit basic?
No, I wouldn't. I don't know, but obviously, obviously the carbon dioxide that we, you know, when we get in a petrol car and turn it on, we emit carbon from those exhausts. Yeah. And you think, oh, how long will that last in the atmosphere? 100 years, 200 years? It actually lasts for 60,000 years.
Wow.
So you think if we've trapped CO2 emissions in the atmosphere over the past few decades, that's actually equivalent to 400,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs going off every day. And in the last 16 of the 17 years have been the warmest years. I've just recently been looking at some reports that say this is the warmest winter we've had on record. So those are some of the effects behind climate change.
I think but in the way that it actually heats up the planet, I think, just to give a little bit of insight into that, is what we're doing is we're making the air denser.
Okay.
So the sunlight is actually being trapped in it. These particles that hang in the air, sunlight carries energy with it. That energy transfers into heat when it's passing through other molecules.
Yeah.
And so that's hitting up the atmosphere because we've got this much CO2 hanging in the atmosphere that our normal ecological systems cannot handle. I mean, obviously everything was in a finite balance up until the age of the Industrial Revolution, where the trees managed the CO2. We inhale, we produce CO2 ourselves, don't we?
Yeah.
You know, we inhale the oxygen and we exhale it out. But we've always been in this finite balance with the other species on the planet, and the trees, the grasses, the swamps, the algae, the fungi, all this has all been doing a job for millennia at clearing it all up. Until then, what we done was we tapped into all that sun energy that was trapped underneath the surface of the planet. And we hit the Industrial Revolution. So we started taking all that CO2 that was trapped underneath the planet as well. So it's not even just that we're producing so much ourselves extra, but we're also extracting it from these banks that have been sat underneath the crust of the planet for millions of years.
Yeah, so this is beginning to sound like a science lesson, and so it should, because it is very scientific stuff. But I'm just gonna say, like, this is not a new thing that we've just learned about in the last year, 2 years. I know it's a lot more topical now, but the first time I came across this was 1987.
And we'll all remember that, won't we? The greenhouse effect, the
The greenhouse
CFCs.
effect, yeah, exactly
Our
that.
world leaders came on stage and they said, I remember George W. Bush coming on and saying, well...
Senior, that was right.
Right, it
George Bush
was senior. Yeah, if these people are worried about the greenhouse effect, well, I got something for them. They haven't seen the White House effect.
Oh, my God.
And, of course, everybody listened to our world leaders, didn't we? I mean, so many people put their head in the sand. And here we are now, 35 years later, and we are facing climate disaster.
Climate disaster, exactly.
In our lifetime.
So there was a very popular film that was released recently. I think it was called Don't Look Up.
Yes.
Is that right? Don't Look Up. You guys seen that?
Brilliant.
Last Christmas.
Yeah.
I
and
watched it 3 or 4 times.
It was it was absolutely brilliant in that it was so realistic, wasn't it? Like, and I know it's satire, in large parts it was satire, especially the interactions with the president and the president's advisors, and you know, just the TV interview, which was just ridiculous. There was so much of it that was satirical and yet so lifelike, and I feel like, you know, that was the point of the movie. We're kind of living in parallel to that movie. Like, everybody knows we've got a serious problem, but everybody seems to be burying their head in the sand about it.
Absolutely. And it was really interesting in that movie when the scientists that saw this asteroid coming to Earth got to the point where they were screaming, everybody's going to die.
Yes.
And yet we had these kind of GMB-style news presenters going, oh, OK, we'll just move on. But something I really wanted to say as well is that we've all heard of the 1.5 Paris Agreement, or many of us has, and 1.5 degree warming is the limit to which we were supposed to stay under to protect humanity, or to protect the planet. And I've recently read that to be confident beyond reasonable doubt of staying below 1.5 degrees warming, we'd have to have gone net zero worldwide by 2022. That was last year. And there is no way, looking at our governments and our leadership, I mean, I'm doing all I can at the local council on the Climate Change Environment Group, but, you know, our leaders, our governments are not bailing us out. So we will have to do this within our own communities, our own local authorities, and mitigate the effects of the change that's coming. Currently, we're on a trajectory of 3 to 4 degrees of warming. So I'm kind of doing what those scientists did on their shows, is saying, look, you know, the clock is 5 past midnight already. We're like those cartoon characters, you know, where they run and they jump in midair, and we're hanging in midair now, and we're going to be falling.
So just for the benefit for our listeners, you mentioned the 1.5 target. The 1.5, you're talking about 1.5 degrees, and you're talking about that's an increase, that's a change in average global pre-industrial temperatures. So we've got this pre-industrial, which I think they average between 1901 and 1960. And they say, what is the sea? Is it the surface sea temperature across multiple points around the world? And they'll take those temperatures and say, let's take an average of that. And let's say the average is 12 degrees, as an example. I don't know, 10 degrees, 12 degrees, whatever. And they say that's the pre-industrial level. And if that rises by 1.5 degrees, then we're in trouble. Yeah.
And we're already on 1.2.
And what we've done is we've been fighting this fight since 1985, 1988, whatever. My first memory was about 1987, 88. It might have been before that. But we've been fighting this fight for 30 to 40 years. And not only have we already given up on our 1.5 target, we're now projecting what the world might look like at 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees. I've seen some charts that project sea levels rising by 8 meters. So I just want to bring you back in, Alex. You said something really interesting off air, and I challenged you on it, and I think you corrected me quite quickly, but I want to bring that out. You said something about the decimation of flora, fauna, a certain percentage of species. Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. Well, in just the last 40 years, wildlife populations across the board, across all wildlife, populations have plunged by an average of 69%.
Okay.
So if you imagine 40 years ago, let's take that as the 100% benchmark of how many animals were alive. Out of all those animals that were alive, 7 out of 10 are now dead.
That's incredible.
That's in 40 years.
Yeah.
Now, just to give you an idea, that just 4 years ago, that figure sat at 60%. So we've lost 8% in the past 4 years. So even with all this sound that we've got around climate change, even with Greenpeace, WWF and all these amazing organisations that have come on the scene over the course of the last 40 years whilst this has been happening, in the course of the last 4 years, the decimation of our wildlife has increased.
Yeah.
And that's with the knowledge of humankind knowing what they're doing.
And then the question I had for you off air was, how much of that is driven by climate change? And I guess what I mean is how much of that is driven by the effects of climate change, and how much is it driven by human activity?
Yeah, of course.
And you posited that it was the same thing.
Absolutely.
So talk to me about that.
Well, human activity, what we do is we go around the planet and we repurpose it, don't we?
Yes.
We take away these environments that animals have used as their habitat for millennia. And we repurpose it into something else. We steal their home, and by doing so, we steal their life. We steal the food that they live on. We steal the homes that they live in. I mean, even if you just have a look at, we talk about human activity and the effect it has in Peterborough, the environmental capital. Just last year, we decided to chop down our oldest oak tree, a cathedral to nature. But it's estimated that within that single tree alone, it would have been the habitat for over 60,000 different species. That's across the board, going from bacteria, vertebrates, invertebrate, bats, birds, things that you can't even think of, you know, from a microscopic scale.
Oh, yeah, you said 60,000. I couldn't name you 60, let alone 60,000.
There you go. And that's just in one tree alone. That's just one effect that taking that one tree has had on populations of these animals.
What is it that makes you super passionate about this, other than the let's fight against the destruction of the planet? What is it you personally, Nicola, that really makes you, do you feel somewhat responsible? Because I mean, I hear all this and I think, you mentioned the date 1960s. I mean, I was born in the 70s. So for me, it's like, it's my lifetime that has seen the massive escalation.
I think we're all quite similar ages as well, aren't we? So we've all seen the same dynamics.
So our generation is responsible. And do you feel that sense of responsibility, or do you feel like you're working to a higher purpose, or what is it?
I feel angry. Because I, like you guys, when I was at school in the early mid-90s, I knew, we knew about greenhouse gases, the ozone layer, CFCs. And I, as a young pupil in a secondary school, thought, well, people must be doing something about this. And then, of course, once I did get into politics, I realised that people actually weren't. And that's why I joined the Green Party, because the Green Party was saying the right things on the environment and showing leadership. I mean, Caroline Lucas was the constructor of the Green New Deal, which we can talk about.
So Caroline
later.
Lucas is the only Green MP in the House of Commons, represents Brighton. Yep.
That's right, yeah. And she was the constructor of the Green New Deal. And actually, and we'll talk about things like that later, but actually AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she came to the UK, sent some research to the UK to find out about the Green New Deal and to then implement that in the US. Now, what I did is once we'd set up, I declared a climate emergency in 2019. Well, we all did, but I pushed for that to happen.
Sure.
And we had a working group, and now we've got a climate change and environment scrutiny committee, which is really highlighting the reports that we're writing, and we've got a growing climate team.
Sure.
I went to the Youth Council, which is young teenagers on the Youth Council in Peterborough, and said, look, this is what I thought when I was your age, and nobody was doing anything.
It's a brilliant message.
And this is what we're doing. And actually, we now have on that committee 2 very committed youth councillors that come and ask some fantastic questions about the work that we're doing at a local authority level. So I guess it was anger and rage that actually, and still now, governments are definitely not even touching the sides of what we really need to do. So we do need to see more Green representatives, more Greens in local and national government. That's my passion around it, really.
And you're growing the Greens locally, aren't you? I've noticed you've increased your size by about 33% recently.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
great
we
news.
have.
Great
Yeah.
news. Okay, well, I hope that works out well for you. so, I mean, I speak to my kids, Alex. I speak to my kids about climate change. I went away to a conference, nothing to do with climate change. This was an actuarial conference. We talk about life insurance. We talk about, the expected life, life expectancy and stuff like that.
And it must be affecting these markets as well, mustn't it?
So, yeah, the biggest threat to global markets is climate migration. Mm-hmm. Right, and this is the capitalist view of the world. It's like climate change is happening, people are going to die, severe weather events are going to occur. That's all fine and well, but what's going to affect capital markets? What's going to affect our pension pots? What's going to affect our money? And it's such a cynical way of looking at it. But unfortunately, this is what the people in power do. They're driven by the value of the pound and the returns on the investments, and they're worried about 143 million climate migrants by 2050. And if you think about total number of refugees on the planet right now is about 6 million, 6 million, I think.
Yeah, thereabouts.
We have asylum seekers trying to seek asylum here in the UK, about 20,000 a year.
Yep.
And it's on the Daily Mail headlines pretty much every other day.
Of course it is.
What happens when you've got 143 million people needing a new home?
You have a lot of conflict, don't you?
A lot of conflict, and not just that. I mean, this is it. Like, I had a conversation with Faisal Mahmood's got a laughy face. I hope you're not laughing at global conflict, Faisal. I hope you were laughing at my earlier comment. But I mean, I was talking to my children about this, and it was like a jaw drop moment. And I know you guys are aware of it, so it's not really a jaw drop moment. But I spoke to I'm saying, look, there's going to be 143 million. The numbers don't make any sense. But I'm like, imagine 143,000 people needed new homes, and let's say we took 10% of them. We're a big country. We're a rich country. We'll take 14,000. I said we're struggling with 4,000. We can't take 14,000. There'll be political backlash. There'll be people fighting.
Can you imagine Suella Braverman on this one?
Suella Braverman, yeah, on this one, exactly. And then I said, and the problem isn't even that big. The problem is 1,000 times bigger by 2050, based on even average estimates of what our pollution is going to be like over the next 15, 20 years.
So countries like Syria had 4 consecutive years of drought. 3 million people were forced into extreme poverty, and many migrated to the cities and then continued to migrate. But there was also massive unrest and progress, which some people argue caused some of that civil war. And we look at countries like Indonesia. They're so affected by flooding that they're looking at moving their capital, Jakarta, to another area in their country because there's 23 million people are going to be affected. So and what really annoys me is people like the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which have renamed themselves Net Zero Watch, and they keep pumping out climate delayism and denialism. They're trying to, for example, say, can the poor afford all this net zero carbon technology? And they're trying. And it's people like them, which are spearheaded by figures like Nigel Farage, who wanted to go around the country on this net zero watch. But luckily, a couple of venues turned him away and said, no, we don't want you on our show. But it's people like Farage that have fought against people coming into this country. And actually, the problems climate change is going to, or climate crisis, we should probably be talking about crisis and catastrophe rather than just change. With 143 million refugees,
let's call it
we
what it
really
is,
need to look at it seriously, and it's really contradictory that we've got.
Yeah, I mean, I have to just caveat that a little bit. A lot of those will be moving from coastal regions to more inner cities. So there's going to be an element of within country resettling, but there's going to be, countries like, Maldives is going to be completely underwater. Beautiful honeymoon destination. Lots and lots of people go there.
And of course, there's the economic migrants which increase with this as well. And you do say that they're going to move inwards. Well, of course, the rich people won't. The rich will look to flee that land, to flee the conflict which has obviously come to it, and seek refuge in more capitalist, neoliberally welcoming places for them and their finances.
Yeah, absolutely. Is climate change a creeping act of war on poorer nations? And I'll posing that to you, Alex, because I like how you think on this. Like, are we not climate terrorists when it comes to the impact? And we were talking off air about, and Faisal's brought this up brilliantly. Also, a lot of floods in the subcontinent. Look at the 2 to 3 extremely hot days. So it's like, I've just come back from Pakistan, and I went to visit some family who live not too far away from Islamabad. And as I was traveling to their house, I drove past through some fields, and there was tents set up. And I said, well, why are these tents set up? You shouldn't have people in tents. And these are the people who've escaped the floods, but they've got nowhere to go.
Yeah.
And they're basically occupying somebody else's farmland. And it was very difficult for them to get that farmland. And somebody's been almost, allowed them to occupy his farming land, and they've set up tents, and they've been there now for about 4 months. What we're doing to these people is we're moving them, shifting them, but we're kind of doing it passively. We're kind of doing it incrementally, and it's like step by step. But we are the biggest polluters: the US, the UK, China, obviously now, but Germany, France, Western Europe, and the effect is being felt by people in poorer nations. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, firstly, by far, the richer countries cause the most damage on the planet.
Yeah.
The richest people cause the most damage on the planet. The poorest people cause the least damage, make the least impact, whatever it is. Even if they're driving around in a 60-year-old car that's a gas guzzler, they're still on that bottom end. They're doing the least damage. But you're quite right. The countries with the higher economic poor are going to be the highest affected. And in so many different ways, from the displacement, from the economic pressures that are put on them, from the sanctions that will be put on them because of the way that they're now not entering the economic forums.
We're stopping countries from developing because we're saying there's too much CO2 in the air. You need to stop your industrial revolution, which followed ours by about 60, 70 years. And you're aspiring to be like us.
There's a reason why it followed us by that length of time, isn't there? Because we withheld all the technology from them. So again, that's us that has put them in that situation, and we now try and punish them.
And
for
look at
it.
our colonialism and our culture of extracting from and exploiting countries. And we've taken from those countries as well. So
I absolutely have to read this comment out. It's from a lovely young lady named Alicia Ali. Same surname as mine. She might be my daughter. The low-income countries are suffering due to the actions of the West. I love it. Love that political statement she's made. But absolutely spot on. And
I mean, we
are the West. She has to.
Well,
Alicia has to remember we are the West, so we're responsible for the poorer countries suffering. Faisal Mahmood says, "Will electric cars and lorries help?" I think I can answer that and say no, they won't, because electric cars and lorries still need electricity. And if the electricity you're using is generated by burning greenhouse gases, you're still pumping CO2 into the air. If, however, you decide to generate electricity by renewable resources, or sources rather, like solar, wind, tidal, and so on, then you generate clean electricity, and then that technology will help. Go on.
There is, however, you can drive a 4.6 litre vehicle around, and it will not do as much damage as what creating and building a single electric vehicle will, in the space of 20 years, I believe it is. So electric vehicles are not here to save the planet. Electric vehicles are here to save the car industry and those who sit above it.
I really want to explore that a little bit because that was news to me. So we'll talk a little bit about that after the break. We are heading into the break. I just want to finish reading these comments before we do. Faisal also says, look at the 2 to 3 extremely hot days we had in the summer in the UK.
Frightening.
Right, so I remember this because that's the day I ruptured my Achilles. 42, 43 degrees, I think it was in Peterborough.
Absolutely scary.
Unheard of, right? Record temperatures.
Oven temperatures. I mean, I had a window open at one point. I had to close it. I felt like I was walking past an oven. And
So the advice was leave the windows open overnight, and the moment it's light,
Close
shut the
them.
windows, shut the curtains. Basically sit in the dark and hope that the insulation in your house keeps the heat out.
it was quite frightening. And I was asked to write something for the PT, and I wrote this really long manifesto almost because it was so terrifying. And I'd watch climate people tell me it will be the heat
Yeah.
that gets us first rather than flooding. And it was happening in front of my eyes.
Absolutely. Guys, we're going to head into a break, but I just want to say, look, appreciate everybody's comments. I know this isn't the most inspiring of shows. It's actually quite depressing, but it's just things that we need to talk about. So do keep interacting. We're going to be off for a short break, and we'll be back straight away after that to talk more about climate change.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're listening to Salam Radio, and it's now time for Isha Azan. This Azan is sponsored by Park Foods. Come and see the difference.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Ashhadu an la ilaha illa Allah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa Allah. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر، الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
الله أكبر الله أكبر، لا إله إلا الله. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم، وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم رب هذه الدعوة التامة والصلاة القائمة آت محمدا الوسيلة والفضيلة وابعثه مقاما محمودا الذي وعدته. اللهم آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم بك نحيا وبك نموت وإليك المصير رضينا بالله ربا وبالإسلام دينا وبمحمد صلى الله عليه وسلم نبيا ورسولا.
Peterborough's community radio station.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Salam Radio. This is Why Politics Matters. I'm your host, Imtiaz Ali, here with Alex Blower and special guest for the day, Councillor Nicola Day, leader of the Green Group from Peterborough City Council. Very, very happy to have you on, Nicola. Thank you so much for your contributions in the first half. We've had lots of interesting chats. But I really want to pick up on, Alex, your point about this production of the electric car and how long it would take to use renewable energy on an electric car to offset the carbon footprint of using a 4-litre SUV instead.
Right.
So tell me about this, because this is news to me, genuinely. I did not know this. I thought anybody who was buying an electric car was doing something good for the planet, but it sounds like they're doing something horrific.
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, the production of an electric vehicle, the actual footprint which it leaves when compared to a gasoline or petrol vehicle, the production difference is a 60% increase in the carbon footprint in production alone. Okay, so that's just in the actual creation thereof. Now, I knew you were going to question me on the years that it took.
But even if you said 5, I'd be shocked. But
Yeah,
you said about 40, right?
It's over 10.
Okay.
That I can say 100% firmly. I'm sure there'll be somebody out there that's going to be a little bit quicker on the search than what I am and
Sure.
can confirm this for us.
Faisal actually has commented specifically about this point, so I'm glad we picked it up. But Faisal said, interesting point by Alex about electric cars. I think the process of manufacturing and disposing batteries is a big issue. Until that's sorted, alongside power generation, maybe using Tesla's idea of gigafactories, which generate energy from renewable tech. So I think he's kind of agreeing with your point about the footprint of production. And the footprint of production absolutely needs to be taken into account.
You also have to weigh that footprint of production against using what's already there and available. There's a lot of this green talk which is actually about making this shift into green industry. And what that's actually doing is that's got nothing to do with saving the planet. All of this talk to move into green industry is to do with saving industry and saving ways of life. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't try and save as much of our ways of life as what we can. We're human species. We don't like change.
Sure.
We don't accustom to it very well. However, there's a lot more to be said for environmental pursuits in using what we already have, repurposing what has already been taken out the
Recycling,
ground.
basically. Recycling, yeah.
Recycling and upcycling.
And repurposing, yeah.
Before taking and producing new.
Yeah.
That should always be our first port of call, yeah. And I would say that there's plenty of evidence out there that suggests that same argument transpires into a lot of dynamics to do with the vehicle and transport industry as well.
Yeah, no, excellent point. Nicola, just going to bring you back in. Are you one of those people that encourages people to take responsibility, or are you more sympathetic to the argument that 75% of all greenhouse gases are emitted by 100 corporations, and we need to eliminate those corporations and find substitutes and do find better ways of doing things?
Yeah, yeah, you're absolutely right. There has been previously, or in previous decades, this focus on individualism and what we can do individually: recycle, reuse, get an EV.
And just to interrupt you there, I want to say this because that sounds a little bit like, you know, when you're struggling with the cost of living crisis and you're told to cook cheaper food.
Exactly.
It sounds
gaslighting.
It's gaslighting, basically.
By your
gaslighting.
But
government.
actually, what we do need is a complete systems change, and we need to move those industries away from this terrible destruction. We can't maintain our current way of life based on growth at all costs. And other countries, such as, for example, Bolivia, in their national development plan, they look at things like living well, in harmony with nature, goals for joy and happiness, the construction of a less consumerist, less individual neoliberal society, and they give rights to nature. We need to be looking at some of those countries. Cuba, for example, is rated as the only country in the world developing sustainability and meeting human needs within the capacity of the planet. It uses less energy, produces less CO2, better air quality than comparator countries, and it has the highest population of protected forests.
So this is a show in its own right. We're talking about GDP versus other
Yes.
measures of human development and growth. And I think Bhutan has a gross a happiness index of its population, and they measure that year on year.
Yeah.
And as long as that's improving, they're happy as a country.
That's
They do
the
their
one
job.
that they base everything on, isn't it?
They base everything
and
on
it
it.
guides their elections. It guides a lot of their political landscape.
Whereas the Western world, we're talking about GDP and GDP per capita, because the only thing that matters is how much money is circulating.
And in the Western world, just think about it, those economic, social and environmental issues are causing things like eco-anxiety, mental health issues.
Yeah.
We have some of the highest concentrations of mental health issues in the world, and that's because we're not living as we should be or in harmony with nature, and we are, and this pursuit for, it's almost like we look at rich people as if it's something to aspire to have all of
Absolutely.
these things. And I won't talk about capitalism just yet, but we need to move away from a capitalist, consumerist society. That will have a huge impact on our carbon outputs.
I think we're good to take the conversation to capitalism. I think let's do that. So
If I may
go
just
on.
pick up on something Nicola said there, actually, and what you were saying about well, the point I wanted to make is about we all know that when we're not dealing with the things we need to deal with, when we procrastinate, when we've got important issues in our life
Yeah.
that we keep fending off, then it's not very good for our mental health. It increases anxiety, and studies in psychology show that this is a huge factor towards depression.
Have you done your
towards-
coursework yet? You've done it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
Good. Okay.
But these are all caused by that. Now, we all know climate change is coming. We all know that the solutions aren't there, and those that with the authority over us aren't working towards a solution. Of course we've got eco-anxiety. Even people that don't. I mean, before the pandemic, there was a worldwide piece of research done that came back and showed that 6 out of 7 people globally felt insecure. And that was pre-pandemic
Yes, yeah.
levels. Here we are 4 years down the line from when that study was done. Climate change is on our doorstep. The weight on people's mental health that this is all doing, and still talking about GDP, like you say, rather than talking about what we're doing about all these problems, it's not good for a population. It can't be.
Yeah. So the best thing I think that's come out from the discussion so far is this term net zero. That term, I think, has been such a powerful term because people get it. People say, right, we're going to emit stuff, but we're going to take stuff out the atmosphere as well. And overall, as long as we're not increasing the total volume of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we won't be making the problem worse. But you talked about 1.5 being the long-term target, 1.5 degree increase. We're already at 1.2. Now, what are you saying about conservative estimates of where we might end up by 2030, 2040?
At the moment, we're on a trajectory by 2050 of moving to about 2 degrees of warming.
Oh my
Beyond
God.
that, 3 or 4. And also, what we know is that I've got some bits about
Go for it, yeah.
Greenland. I mean, the Greenland ice sheet is retreating 20 metres per day in 2013, and now it's 20 metres per year. And in the Antarctic, our ice melt, we know that may well completely melt over the next 100 years. I mean, that won't affect us directly now, but there will be 60 metres of sea level increases before that
Sorry,
happens.
did you say 60 metres? 60?
If all of the ice melts in Antarctica, there will be 60 metres of sea level rises. So, and that's probably going to happen, in way into the future. But, we've all just discussed, we've got children sitting here now.
Yeah.
And if we want to protect our future generations, then we really must do something about this pursuit of economic growth. You listen to what the Conservatives are saying at the moment. They're still pursuing economic growth. They're talking about levelling up and growing places and spending money on things. And what we need to be doing is stopping that, looking at post-growth, sharing things. And we also need to, as I said earlier, we need to look at connecting environmentalism with a call to end capitalist exploitation.
You mentioned about the continual growth thing, and I think that's absolutely paramount. Somebody brought this to my attention a couple of years ago when I first started having a look at this. And now if you have a look at continual growth on a graph across time,
Go on.
okay, there's only one place that you will find in nature or in science where that graph shape is reproduced. And that place is in an endothermic explosion when you put time and heat because of the exponential growth which there is. So what capitalist is looking for is that dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And if we have a look at it for analogy, maybe climate change is that bomb.
Yeah, I don't think capitalists want the bomb. They want the exponential growth and hopefully get off the ship before it sinks. Yeah. And that's why they're building spaceships to fly off to Mars and stuff.
Can I just tell you and your listeners that when I sort of kept an eye on Extinction Rebellion. I've been to some of the protests. Okay. And when they were first founding Extinction Rebellion, a big video went out to loads of activists.
Sure.
And it was Gail Bradbrook and a couple of and Jim Bendall, a couple of the co-founders. And they said in that video that some of the top billionaires had paid to have an audience with climate scientists to ask them what was going to happen, so they could best equip themselves to keep away from climate disaster.
Oh, there's going to be
they
people... They
know it's happening.
There's going to be people already looking at financial opportunities as a result of climate change. There's going to be people looking at what can we do to maximise the profits we make off the carnage. And just like, Brexit and just like, other war in Ukraine, people are shorting the pound, all that kind of stuff. People are always going to look for that. Faisal's come out with a couple of comments and really thanks for these, Faisal. Faisal said, these are interesting facts. I think more needs to be done to raise awareness and actively do something about it. Well, one thing you can do, Faisal, is ask Councillor Nicola Day to do a regular show, maybe once a month, on climate change. I think that'd be a really good idea. Genuinely, I'd be happy to contribute to it, and you should maybe think about it. But it's the kind of thing, like you say, why is it not being talked about every single day? Because it's tiring, because it's depressing, because people feel helpless. But there are things that we can do, and we should all do what we can. I've got a chart here. I'm just going to try and describe this chart to you. This talks about the average temperature change from the pre-industrial levels, and this was a chart generated in 2017 where we were up to 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So about the 1.1, 1.2 Celsius that you mentioned. And then there's 3 scenarios that go beyond that. And that's a low scenario, a mid scenario, and a high scenario. And there's some overlap and there's some uncertainty. But really, in the mid scenario, you're looking at by 2050, you're looking at about 4 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 3 degrees Celsius. Translating that to rise in sea levels, long-term rise in sea levels from 3 degrees Celsius is about 8 to 10 meters. So 8 to 10 meters, if you're living anywhere that's less than 10 meters above sea level, you won't be living there anymore. That's where the water's going to be up to. Parts of London are going to be submerged. Peterborough, pretty much all, is going to be underwater. We've already talked about the Maldives and Indonesia and places like Vietnam. Floods are going to hit Bangladesh. Floods are already hitting Pakistan. Floods are going to hit all around the world. There's one other thing which was really really interesting. I listened to a talk by, I think it was Sir David King. I think I mentioned him to you. He said that people were saying, what's all this about global warming when we've got ice storms in Texas? Do you remember Texas? Like, was it August, September time? They had, or was it July time maybe? They had ice storms, they had hailstones. And he showed us a map, and it was interesting because Texas sits further south than Charleston. Charleston's a little bit further north. And Charleston's further north, and it was suffering from temperature of 42 and 43 and 44 degrees Celsius. And at the same time, Texas was suffering an ice storm. And the professor described the circulation of the wind around the North Pole. And it's very circular, so it's like a flat top. But because of global warming and the shifting of the ice shelves and the detachment of ice shelves, that circular pattern's actually become more loopy up and down. So you've got areas of cold and areas of hot that are further north and further south of each other, which is non-intuitive. And he said, although the ice was quite shocking, like you said earlier, the heat led to about 120 otherwise avoidable deaths in a particular state over a 2-day period. And it's just horrific to think that if this continues, we're at 1.2. We're at 1.2. Remember this, people, we're at 1.2. What happens at 1.5? This isn't linear. This is exponential.
I think what you've got to think about it in terms of climate and the change and the crisis is that it's like a pendulum.
Yep.
And it's like you've knocked a pendulum off balance. If you ever knock a pendulum off balance, it goes completely haywire. So you get these extreme storms, extreme weathers. Things that we should expect are rising temperatures, flooding, wildfires. We've seen all of that. Extreme storms, water source shortages, soil erosion, acidification of the oceans. All those things will happen. Now, apparently there are projections that by 2050, London will have a climate of Barcelona's, Madrid will have a climate of Marrakesh's, Stockholm will have a climate of Budapest, Seattle will have the climate of San Francisco's, and there'll be water stresses in all of those regions. Now, if you think about that, what will the temperature be like in Istanbul or Karachi?
Karachi, yeah.
Or,
So,
And there's indicators for this already. I mean, animal migration and everything is moving further into the northern hemisphere as well. I think.
there was news of migratory birds that were completely thrown off because they didn't know what they were doing and they were just migrating at wrong times.
Well, actually, there's a lot of evidence now to say that these patterns are now changing.
Okay, yeah.
Because of the so we've met. Up until not very long ago, we would have called the era we live in the Helocene. Okay, now breaking the meaning of these words down, helio or Heliocene, helio from sun,
Yeah.
scene, time. So what it means is that we're in a time when the planet, the most largest factor affecting it was the sun. We no longer live in the Heliocene, we now live in the Anthropocene. Anthropo from anthropology, from human, which means humans are now the most impactful source of change upon the planet. Okay,
Don't want anyone to think this radio show is not educational, guys. Carry on. No, I learned something new every week, honestly.
Currently,
Yeah.
animal patterns, as you've just said, are completely haywire, and they are changing. There's research out there to suggest that a total of 40% of all species are currently in a migratory pattern north to find new habitat because the environment has been changed adverse for their survival due to the effects of mankind.
Can I add to that? In a book that I've just been reading, which is excellent, it's caused a bit of controversy, but it's by Karen Bell and it's called Working Class Environmentalism. And she argues that it should be called the Capitalocene because it's capitalism that's driving a lot of this. I've never come across that idea before.
Sure,
But
and it's a fair argument. Let's be honest, humans have survived on this planet for a great many thousands of years without causing this damage.
I feel like socialists, and I feel safe in saying that we're socialists here, but I feel like socialists need to fight against this almost agreed understanding that it's humans and the growth in humankind that is leading to climate change. Now, absolutely, the more humans you have, the more you consume. But if you don't consume, and as a result of your consumption, output CO2, because I feel like those kinds of rhetorics are quite dangerous.
Yeah, I was just going to say, building on that, capitalism is not compatible with sustainability, absolutely not. And what we need to do is dismantle, and this is another thing that Karen Bell argues for, we need to dismantle the main feature of capitalism, which is the private ownership of the means of production.
Okay.
And she talks about creating an eco-state, I mean, basically building ourselves a lifeboat for the storms to come. She talks about redistribution of wealth, cap on excessive incomes and wealth. Apparently, public consumption through public services are more ecologically efficient than private consumption.
Oh, of course, yeah.
So publicly funded welfare states emit lower carbon than countries which rely on private alternatives. So that's why I mentioned Bolivia and Cuba earlier. You know, George Monbiot argues that he talks about us not holding up this idea that we all must enjoy some kind of private luxury and that we actually share. And then he talks about a Brazilian city called Porto Algarve, where the citizens decide how the money should be spent. So they've got better water sanitation, free swimming pools, health, schools and nurseries. It's been so popular that there are large numbers of people now lobbying the city council for tax increases.
This sounds like a democracy.
Wow.
Yeah.
Nicola, that actually sounds like a democracy, like where the people decide how to spend the money. We've had a few comments. Faisal Mahmood says, great idea about the Green Radio Show. You don't have to name it the Green
Okay.
Radio Show, but have a think. Shelley Marie Brennan's commented, our local
Hello, Shelley.
hedgehog specialist. Yeah, she looks after, takes in hedgehogs. She said, we've noticed this in hedgehog behaviours. The fact that in parts of the country, some of the rescues have hoglets in already is shocking. Some hedgehogs are not going into hibernation until January or February.
So this would probably have been as a result of that mild part of weather we had just prior to Christmas, wasn't it, when we actually had temperatures suddenly just shoot up to 14 degrees. And this is another huge part of climate change. When we talk about extreme weather, it's not just the extreme scale, it's the extreme changes. Now, we speak a lot about that warmest day that we had last year where it hit 40 degrees. For me, the big story there was the fact that over the course of 48 hours, our average temperature changed by over 15 degrees.
That was incredible. Yeah. It went from ridiculously hot to just about warm.
But that change, the swing of 15 degrees.
Yeah, it's the gradient, isn't the temperature
It
gradient?
is, yeah. And if it had happened, I mean, it just so happens that we live here at a time when the planet is at a temperature which suits our needs. If that 15% change had happened at any other point in the temperature scale, it would have had serious effects.
And if you speak to farmers and people that work in agriculture, they will tell you what's been happening because they work with the weather
They've been telling
outdoors
us for
every day.
ages,
They've been
haven't
telling
they?
us for years.
Yeah.
And if you think, if we get heat waves and they continue to extend in our summers, here in the UK, across the world, all of the agriculture, firstly, we will lose some of the agriculture. That's our world food basket. That will drive food prices off the scale. I mean, it's already food prices.
Yeah,
are
we think we've
increasing
got
now.
inflation now,
Yeah.
food inflation now.
If you think about the UK, we get I think 50-60% of our food from other nations. Well, are they going to send their food to us if they haven't got any food?
they've
Will
got
they be
nowhere
able
to
to
live.
grow
Exactly.
it anymore
Yeah.
because of
So
the changes?
we have to even think. I mean, I've put a food strategy through at the Peterborough City Council, and that's being developed because it's so. And the whole idea it's about from field to fork, but also food poverty. Lauren Kendricks could come on and talk to you about that. I could bring you a raft of people that could come on and talk.
That
about
genuinely
different
sounds like a show.
subjects.
Honestly, I'd be interested in that.
But it's so important, our food security, because what can we do without food?
Yeah.
You know?
Shelley's come back and said, hey, with a smiley face. So she's still listening. Alicia's asked another question. She's made another comment. She said, can we reverse these negative effects of climate change? So, yeah, Alicia is 17 years old. She's going to be living her middle ages through a period where we think we're going to have, a horrific situation worldwide. I guess if we were net zero right now, then what we're saying is we're not pumping out more greenhouse gases than we're removing from the atmosphere. So to get to net zero, right, what would we need to do today to get to net zero?
What we need to do today is see the implementation of a Green New Deal, which I mentioned earlier. This is something that Caroline Lucas started before she was an MP and something that AOC in the US has brought on. But we would need to see the massive, urgent transformation of the economy. We would need to see renewable energy worldwide, sustainable transport worldwide, infrastructure renewal. We need to see guaranteed jobs for all who want to work. We need to commit to what's called a just transition, which protects wage and job levels. We need to stop opening coal mines. We've just opened a coal mine in Cumbria.
I know.
We need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. We need to see things as well like universal basic incomes, free healthcare, childcare, higher education. And we need to see more people. And I think one of the biggest things we need to see is those things happening. Those things are not happening. A Green New Deal is based on President Roosevelt's New Deal. And his idea was that you pump so much money into the infrastructure of the US that you would actually pull yourselves out of depression. And that's what he did. We need to see that. I mean, at the City Council, we have to get people saying, it's going to cost $8 billion to do this or $8 million to do that.
Sure.
We need to see that money. If we can find £27 trillion or $27 trillion to tackle a pandemic, a global pandemic, which some would argue has come about because we are encroaching on habitats in the wildlife, and that's where we got that disease from. If we're to see those changes, we need that massive change, and we need it now. And
So it's not as simple as saying, do things in your own home. You're saying this needs to be a political change,
Absolutely.
from the top down,
Yeah.
driven by taxation and borrowing.
yeah.
And massive investments and incentives to do things correctly. But also, would you agree that we need to start implementing huge taxation on polluters, or just make it illegal?
Oh, yeah,
Do we just make it
absolutely.
illegal, or do you just put massive taxes on it so it becomes less efficient for them to run their business in a non-environmentally friendly way?
Yeah, it's really. I actually think we should make things illegal, or look at things like a carbon coin, which actually offers incentives to keep carbon in the ground.
Right. So there is a carbon cryptocurrency that allows you to trade the value of the coin to offset. So you've got cheaper countries that produce less that can benefit financially. And we talked about carbon credits in the local area energy plan as well. Do you remember
Yeah,
that?
yes.
So those kinds of things. Is that what you mean? So
Yeah.
if you're super green, you get tax breaks.
Yes.
And if you're not super green, you get tax hikes.
Absolutely, but what we have to really be careful about is if we do put carbon taxes onto those big fossil. I mean, really, the Greens would argue that, I don't know, for example, energy companies should be in public ownership.
Yeah.
But actually, carbon taxes, what we've got to be careful of is that they might punish the poor because those costs will be put onto poorest people.
Okay.
So we have to look at just transitioning, another whole area of debate and topic.
Yeah, I just want to come on to you, Alex. I know you've been listening intently for the last couple of minutes, but I just want you to respond to Faisal's comment, which is, he said, we need to do things locally as well because we need to change mindsets. And that's always the biggest obstacle, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that is actually pretty much hit it on the nail. I mean, you mentioned earlier about GDP and about Bhutan. And what you've got there is two very different cultures that show a very, very different mindset. Those people there are worried about climate change. When they're basing everything on how happy their population are, they've got a motivation to put it in. Whilst we're putting profit as our motivation, we've got no reason to solve these problems.
Excellent. Listen, thank you, Nick Penny. I was unable to read your comment because it was too late in the show. Councillor Nick Day, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you.
We probably need a second show on this. Alex, a pleasure as always.